In a conversation I had with him, he was telling me how important it is for him in the 50 to 60 symposia that they do each year to get better representation of women and underrepresented minorities. And I said, well, us too, and it's hard, and wringing my hands. And he says, in fact, someone who works with me has done research on this. We have data about how hard it is to find, ask, and get women to present at our symposia. And I said, you're kidding, come and present it. So we all wring our hands about it, but as does Woody, but he has some data about it. So I thought it would be great to hear about that, and then we'll figure out what to do.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to give a presentation here today and to attend this board meeting. I have to say it's been an absolutely phenomenally enjoyable experience, so I really appreciate the invitation. The talks have just been superb, and I have to confess it's with some trepidation that I sort of enter this arena, but I hope what I talk about you'll find interesting, and we do indeed have data, but we probably don't have answers. So if you're looking for answers, we may not have them. So many of you in this audience, I think, have attended Keystone Symposia. For those of you that haven't, we're a not-for-profit organization that convenes scientific conferences in the area of molecular and cellular biology. We do about 50 to 60 conferences a year, and we've been doing this for since 1972. In fact, this year was our 40th anniversary. We like to believe that our conferences are absolutely cutting-edge, top-notch conferences, and we have several systems in place to try and ensure that this is really the case. And one of the things that we very strongly believe, in fact, we've believed for 20 years or more at this point, so this is not something new, but one of the things we strongly believe is that diversity in our speakers and in the organizers of our meeting is absolutely critical, because that diversity enriches the meeting, it provides different perspectives on topics, and just overall enhances the quality of meetings. So for many years now, we have been, and I use the word struggling, to improve the diversity of our speakers and organizers. And it's really that issue that I want to talk to, focusing specifically on women. So our mission is pretty much as I stated it before. It's to put on cutting-edge research conferences. And the idea of those conferences is to facilitate scientific exchange, to generate new collaborations, and essentially accelerate the progress of biomedical research. And so our primary goal is to generate outstanding science. That's really the thing that drives everything we do. And consequently, we peer review all of our meetings, and we have a scientific advisory board that does that. And I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. A key aspect of our meetings is that they're open to everybody. So not all research conferences, as you probably know, are just open to anybody. Some of them you have to apply to, but ours are open to all. Although if you present posters at our meetings, there is a peer review process for that. And then one of the key things that we care about, as I said before, is speaker diversity. And what really do I mean about that? Well, we think about diversity in many, many different aspects. Of course, gender, we want to be sure that the speakers at our podium represent the audience, and we have a lot of women in our audience, and so we want to make sure there's a balance of gender. Ethnicity, or making sure that underrepresented minorities are at the podium, is really key, and we have a big program to try and make that happen. Stage of career, we want to make sure that early stage investigators are in our meetings. We also want to make sure there's a balance between industry and academia, and that of course is topic dependent, but it's something that we really have to fight to make sure that that happens. Affiliation and geography go together. I can tell you we've had meetings that were put together where entire plenary sessions were white men from Harvard, and what we do is we kick those back and get them to diversify the plenary session. And then lastly, you might be interested in this speaker return rate. We actually, this is the one place where we have what you might call a quota, where we tell organisers they cannot have more than 30% repeat speakers from an equivalent meeting the year before. We get a lot of fights over that, and we don't win them all, but we win the majority of those. But it's all in the goal of generating diversity in our meetings. So how do we do that? How do we try and get this kind of diversity into our meetings? And the answer comes from the way we program our meetings. And I just want to spend 2 minutes explaining how we actually come up with our portfolio of 50 to 60 meetings every year. The process actually takes 2.5 years, and we start in the fall. So for example, this September, October, we began planning for our meetings in 2015. And we have a scientific advisory board, which is currently 71 very prominent scientists and people from industry who basically drive this process. And they meet twice a year. They meet in January and June to basically develop our portfolio. But the process starts in the fall with an online wiki-like system where all of the SAB members discuss meeting topics and ideas, and that's all done online. And then in December, we collate all of that information. We get rid of duplication and so on and so forth. And then when the Scientific Advisory Board comes to Keystone, Colorado for their first face-to-face meeting in January, they use that as a foundation to think about what's going to be exciting in science 2.5 years hence. And they essentially give us upwards of 70 meeting ideas. So they'll give us the topic, they'll tell us what ought to be in each particular meeting, whether there are particular aspects that need to be covered. They'll tell us how much industry participation we should expect, and they'll also give us the names of potential organisers. So then we run with that information after January, and we start contacting organisers. We get them to propose meeting ideas, and those come in May. And then the Scientific Advisory Board meets again, and they review all those proposals, and there are 3 possible outcomes. One possibility is that the meeting is simply rejected. In that case, that's obviously embarrassing. Unfortunately, it's relatively rare. The meeting could also just be accepted, but of course in the majority of cases, the meeting's sent back for revision. So we send it back to the organisers for revision, they revise the meeting, then it might go through a second review online, or we might just accept it. But at the end of that process, typically by October or November, we can start inviting speakers a good year in advance of the meeting. So that's the basic process that we go through. It's pretty complicated. So how do we drive diversity in this? Well, there are several points of entry where we can have an impact. The first is we've trained our Scientific Advisory Board about these diversity issues as best as we can. And we talk to them a lot about it, and we insist that they think about it when they're developing and when they're reviewing meetings. And so one thing they can do is that they can identify women organisers for us right off the bat. So we encourage them to do that. Secondly, when we solicit the meetings, and I primarily do that, I point out to the organisers that diversity is going to be a key criteria in the review process. So I put the organisers on alert that we're going to be looking for this. We don't give them quotas or anything, we just tell them that there has to be balance in the meeting. Then, when the programs come in, it goes back to the Scientific Advisory Board. First of all, we look at the programs and we highlight all of the statistics in the meeting. We highlight what fraction of women, whether there are URMs in there, what the industry academic ratio is, and all those kinds of things, so that when the SAB looks at these meetings, they're getting all this information in front of them. And then typically, that program will get sent back to the organisers for revision, often highlighting these areas where they need to work on it. And then finally, after we've basically invited the speakers and the meeting's going to be happening in a short period of time, we find there are typically empty speaker slots, either because someone backed out at the last minute, or it was a spot that was purposely left open because we wanted to include some late-breaking material. We'll often talk to the organizers about would a woman or a URM or something like that fit here, especially if a program's looking particularly weak in that area, because despite all of these efforts, we still have problems with getting the diversity that we would like to see. So that's our process. So how are we doing? So we measure outcomes. For years now, we've been collecting exit surveys on all of the aspects of our meetings, including all of the data about demographics, participation, and so on and so forth. And so we can kind of look at progress. The challenge that I always see is I don't quite know what our denominator is. What do we consider to be successful versus not successful? And so this is a challenge, and one of the things I hope to get out of talking to you today is maybe some help thinking about this and thinking about whether or not we're really successful or not. But our basic thinking is that we can't really influence whether or not universities hire or promote women in science. There's very little that we can do about that, but what we can do is make sure that they're fairly represented at the podium. And so with that in mind, we think that the percentage of women speakers at the podium should in effect reflect the audience, because that audience reflects women in that particular field. And remember, each particular field is likely to be different. So that's our philosophy, and I'd be interested if people have comments about that later. So how are we doing? I mentioned that really this initiative started about 20 years ago, so that's back in the 90s. And I don't know if you can see these numbers. I apologize, they're a little bit small, but I can give you the basic outline here. So you can see that from 1990 all the way through 2012, and notice that the last three are single-year jumps and the first four are five-year jumps. But you can see that in the first column that the number of registrants has increased over time. This doesn't include the speakers, by the way. And if you look at the percentage of female registrants, we've had a steady increase from 26% to 41%. So the number of women in our meetings has steadily increased. We don't know exactly why that is. We don't know if that's because of our efforts or because of other things that are going on. Then if you look at the organizers, the next column is the total number of organizers in our meetings, and then the representation in females. So it goes up from 13% to approximately 31% today. And then in the far columns, you can see the number of speakers, female speakers, and their relative percentages, which also increased to somewhere around about 25%. So we've had an increase, but it's not really that impressive. But the question is, what really is our denominator? We're taking 41% perhaps as our denominator. But when we thought about this, one of the things we realized was that half of our audience are junior people. They're postdocs and they're students, and they're really not part of the demographic that we're picking our speakers from. All of our speakers tend to be very prominent scientists. They're not coming generally from the postdoc and from the graduate student pool. So we went back and kind of looked at these data, and I've put this at the bottom. What we've done is, for 2012, just as an example, we've broken down our attendees into junior and senior participants, male versus female. Junior participants here means postdocs and graduate students, or the equivalent in a company. And senior participants really means anybody above assistant professor or above. There are many different ways you can break this down. It starts to get complicated, but this was the simplest way that we could do it. And when you look at that, what you find is that for junior participants, 51% are women, but for the senior participants, 31% are women. And I think, and maybe you can tell me, I think this reflects these generational changes that are happening. That there are fewer senior women, but there are junior women behind them, or it means that junior women are just dropping out and not reaching that senior level, and it's probably a combination of those two things that I just said. My point here is that we believe, arguably, our denominator is really 31%. if you accept that and you apply that, we're doing pretty well in getting female organizers into our meeting, because you can see that our typical percentage is somewhere between 31 and 33%. If you look at our speakers, though, there's clearly a lag or a difference, because typically we're getting 25% women at the podium, and yet 31% of our senior participants are women. And if you look at the data carefully, it looks like a plateau. So clearly, we need to do something more if you accept this type of analysis. Now, what about junior women? And I've added in an extra pair of columns to that graph. And I just want to quickly mention that in addition to our plenary speakers, we also have what we call short talks. These get introduced into the plenary sessions, or they get introduced as workshops. The short talks are selected from people who have registered for the meeting, and they're selected by the organizers. And so this is something that happens relatively late in the meeting. They're predominantly junior people, but we also have senior people that would speak in short talks as well. But here you can see that the percentage is, and I can't barely read that, I think it's 36% in 2012. And you would predict it would lie somewhere between the senior and junior participation levels, and indeed it does, but we don't have a good way yet to really tell how bad or how good this number might actually be. But clearly we're doing a little bit better at short talks than we are in plenary session talks. Oops. It stopped. And I really need the next slide to go on, because I want to talk about, I think the next one is underrepresented minorities. Do you need this? Yeah, that's a good idea.
So, when you say that you can't influence whether a woman gets noticed, in fact you can, because having a talk at the Keystone, a Keystone Symposia, you don't turn this on when you pass it. So
It's on.
it is?
Yes.
You can really hear me? Oh, great. Okay, thank you. So when a woman comes back having given a talk, that goes on her CV, and that does influence. So that has an impact on the number of seniors. Also, in the major talks, aren't there junior people who are also given the opportunity to give major talks? Because when I've been at the Keystone, there have been.
So
yeah, but
I was also a postdoc and gave a talk at a Keystone meeting.
Exactly.
No, so that's absolutely right. So nothing is absolute.
Right.
What I would say is the vast majority of our plenary session talks are by senior people.
Right.
So there perhaps should be a very slight correction factor to some of those data, which we haven't applied. It's only the occasional meeting where we'll have a postdoc presenting. Now, having said that, so we're talking then about the long plenary talks. If you now think about the short talks, then certainly there's a good chance that a junior person can come in, and this is really great for a postdoc who can be in a plenary session and they give a short talk. It fits with the theme of that particular session. That's absolutely wonderful. And then to come back to your other point, I hope we can influence promotion and tenure decisions, because presumably individuals can point out that they gave a talk at a Keystone meeting, and that theoretically will help them. But what I think I really meant to imply was that if you look at the people, the women that are in science today, that's really the only pool that we can really bring to our meeting. We might be able to influence future generations and their success, but really that pool is all that we can draw from. And I really sort of pitch that in the context of trying to figure out what our denominator is. Because when we try and measure, are we successful or not, we've got to know what yardstick we're using to measure that.
Would it be wrong to ask for a quota if you know that there are 40% of the people who are doing cell biology are women? What would be wrong with that?
This is a good question. I think Mary Ann said it sort of quite clearly, is that what we really want is the best science, and that is the primary driver, and that at least theoretically women, since they're equally good as men at doing that science, ought to be well represented on the program. But we've always shied away from telling an organizer, you've got to get 10 women on this program, because we've always felt that it's much better to cajole them and to let programs know whether they're relatively short on women. But we don't like to go to an organizer and say, you've got one slot left, it has to be a woman. And we can argue and debate about that, but we've always felt that that's not the right way to do it.
One is sort of a thought about that, and then I have a question. Would it be possible when people do get the balance, or you notice that they haven't, that you can say something like, is it because there are not enough funds to bring some of these other people in? Would you have better balance if we gave you $5,000 more or something? That's just, one. I'm just thinking about a carrot, not a stick.
Yeah, and you're talking about the organizers bringing women into their programs.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I should mention is that we essentially pay for everything.
Right.
So what we say to organizers is, we're going to pay for you to bring 28 speakers, because that would be a normal program, from anywhere in the globe, and you can build your dream meeting. And we're going to do everything. We're going to write the grants. We're going to fund it and do all of that. So in essence, that's what we're doing. And that's, I think, gives us quite a lot of leverage in sort of insisting that they follow our rules about diversity. I'm not sure that adding more money to that would necessarily...
I can see that. The second point is I'm very interested in the numbers that you have in the leveling off at 25%. Yeah. You've done remarkably well in getting women as organizers and as senior participants. And we may be getting into some of the difficulties that was described by our speaker this morning from Foundation, where the women in the middle have multiple obligations. I don't know if that's contributing. You'd have to ask.
I can...
And then I've been working with some organizations trying to get daycare or somebody to cover the household expenses for the families that are invited that don't have it. And this isn't a new notion. This comes from the woman who won the Nobel Prize in Germany, and then Shirley Tillman's programs, that small grants be given to families with school age, for whatever you need it, whether you need to clean the house, I don't know if that's another thing. Your numbers aren't bad. I mean, they're really quite impressive. I'm glad you're kicking yourself over the difference, because I'd like to know what it is that causes that difference.
Well, I'm gonna show you some pieces of data. So, and let me just say one thing: we do provide daycare at all of our meetings. We arrange for daycare to be provided.
I must have gone to your meetings before that happened.
That may be. I don't know historically, but certainly today we do that. So any man or woman that comes with kids can put their kids into the daycare. I mean, it's not necessarily cheap. I mean, that's always the issue, but yeah, and wheelchair access and so on. Okay, all right. So,
I just wanted to make one comment. It isn't only that young women have more responsibility when their children are small. Older women have more responsibility also. Caring for people with disabilities and whatnot, that happens in older age. I'm just commenting
Right.
that women's position doesn't end at 35.
Well, I'll show you an interesting statistic on speaker decline rates, Marianne.
But that happens, Lieutenant. That happens in any situation. It's not just scientists, it's not just physicians, it can be business meetings. I mean, that's just life.
Yep.
Women who have young children have that problem.
Yep.
Women who have the sandwich generation. You either have children or you have older parents. And
Yep.
I don't think that's specific to this meeting, and I think the fact that you do provide child care is a big help. And I don't think you can worry about every contingency. I think if the program is interesting enough and that people will find a way to come, because they come to other meetings anyway.
Right.
And I think it's the quality of the content and the unique experience and the prestige that you bring with it. So I think you can do as much as you can, but I don't see how you can solve every problem. It's just not possible.
That's right, but I think we have to do as much as we can, and I think there is more that we can do, and I'll talk about that briefly, actually. The biggest problem that we have as an organization is actually with minorities, and I'm going to touch on minority women, and by minorities I mean underrepresented minority as defined by the federal government. And if you look at our audience, I don't know if you can see this, but if on the left-hand table, you can see that about 6% of our audience are URMs. But, and I'm not showing you these data because it's not really relevant to this meeting, if you look at organizers and speakers, it's actually 2%. So we're doing a terrible job. And we actually have a whole department at Keystone Symposia directed at URM activities. And we only get 2% into our meetings. If you look at those URMs and ask those that do participate in this way and ask how many are women, you can see that for the full plenary talks, it's around about 28%. So not too much different from the whole audience. And for the short talks, which remember is biased towards junior investigators, it's more like 47%. Bear in mind these are small numbers. We're not dealing with really large numbers here. So we're doing okay, I think, with minority women, notwithstanding the fact we're not very good at getting minorities into our meetings. And I should just mention the denominators here. So if you look at the senior URM audience, the junior women are 53% and the senior women are 39%. So, okay. So there were two assumptions that came up, actually from audiences like you or people that mention things to us. And those two assumptions are quite interesting. One is that women decline speaker roles more often than men. And that kind of sort of was raised. So is that true? The other assumption, and I think this is a male assumption, I don't know, is that the gender of the organizers affects the ratio of plenary speakers selected. It does.
We have a lot of evidence for that in the race project.
Okay.
And the advanced programs that NSF has sponsored. That's why I was so impressed that you had 31% women. It makes a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me show you what happened with these assumptions.
Oh, and you find something excitingly different.
Not excitingly different, but possibly different. You judge. You tell me.
No, data comes from all kinds of places.
Yeah. So first of all, the idea that the first one is that women speakers decline more often. So we measured speaker decline rate. This is, we ask a speaker, they say they can't come. And that's important to us, that decline rate. And what you see is, when you look at the male speakers versus the female speakers, these are just single year data points. I don't have statistics. But actually, from our data, women decline more often, less often than men do. And it's pretty consistent year to year to year. Yeah.
I think I have probably a reason for that.
Excellent.
So female scientists has to be very, very efficient. And then, as yes, as I was saying, so as a female scientist, okay, so having one, the invited talk at the Keystone counts many more than going just many small talks. So, if you once get invited, you tend to go. So that's what I feel. And actually, I happen to be one of the co-organizers of the Keystone meeting early in the next year. And then, actually Keystone is doing a really good job. Myself, I can assure I have no gender bias, right? I guess. But we try real best. And then Keystone office still come back to us saying, you're not doing well enough. So that's one thing. But at the same time, there is a huge challenge on us because Keystone at the same time doesn't let us invite the speakers. That's 3 times in a row, 3 years in a row. And then, so compared to the ACB meeting on which program committee I happen to be on for the next year meeting. So it's a huge meeting. So then from there, from this huge pool, it's not hard at all to pick a really great female scientist who's not repeating too many times. That's because thousands of people attending. For each Keystone meeting, that's only 200 to 300 at the most. For this size of the meeting, to get the really good number of the prominent female speakers is actually hard. So I think this number is really outstanding, I would say.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So remember, we're picking, though, our plenary speakers from the globe, right? So those initial selections of speakers are from the entire world. The selection of the short talks is from the people that attend. And no, this is just plenary. This is not. So the short talk decline rate is minuscule because they're already coming, and who's going to turn down an opportunity to talk? So. So we were a bit surprised about this because we had been led to believe this would be much higher. What about the other issue of having female organizers? So this is our 2013 season, which obviously is just getting underway. And it turned out that in this particular year, we didn't have any all-female teams. So most of our organizing teams are 3 people, but we didn't have a 3 female organizing team. But embarrassingly, we had 12 all-male organizing teams. So that's the 3rd one down, no female organizers. But then we also had mixed teams. And in fact, approximately just over half of the teams were sort of mixed male and female. And if we looked at what those teams did and asked, who did they select? Did they select men, women? What was the ratio? What we found was that if we had a lead female organizer, so that's the person that's really in charge, we had about 26% female speakers. And if there was a female co-organizer in the team, it was 25% female speakers. The no female organizers, or the men organizers, had 22%. So there's a difference there. But it's not the big difference that we expected. We actually anticipated there'd be a big difference here. And this is probably not statistically significant. We're going to go back and look at this in previous years.
The climate has changed tremendously in the last 20 years.
Yeah,
On that.
I think that's probably right, and that's probably the explanation.
Do you think it's also because of the way you structured your request? I mean, you have really good results. I mean, you may be kicking yourself over them in some ways, but they're pretty spectacular, considering a lot of the, I'm more in the medical field, so, but where we even have more women than in some of the other fields. But like my field has 80% women, and you wouldn't notice it from the podiums. Right. So you're doing something quite good. Now you're true. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt.
That's right.
Never mind. I'll ask later.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try and rush through this. Now, what about the next generation of scientists? We have a number of programs. We have general scholarships that, when we get money for those from various sources, those are picked by the organizers of the meeting. We have underrepresented minority scholarships, and that's primarily driven by a Minority Access to Research Career grant that we hold. And then we have Global Travel Awards. So I have a big Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation grant that brings individuals in from developing countries to our meetings. So how are we doing with these? And with these, of course, we have a denominator because we have the applicant pool, and we can see how we're awarding from the applicant pool. And here are the data. So the applicants are in the middle columns, and then the awards are in the right columns for each of these different categories. And you can see that for general scholarships that the organizers pick, we're 52% women when the applicants are 56% women. So pretty close, although we're typically below. That 52 to 56 ratio is typical over a number of years. For the Global Health Awards and the URM scholarships, we pick them internally, and we seem to be doing better. We're at least equal to or sometimes surpassing the applicant proportion of women. Do we practice what we preach? Now we get to another sort of issue. So we have a board of directors. So we have, should be 15, it's 14 right now. And on our board of directors, we have 11 men and 3 women. And I'm embarrassed to say we just lost a man and we lost a woman, and we replaced her with a man. But our chair is Julian Zerath, who is the new chair of the Nobel Prize Committee for Medicine and Physiology. So this is really a fantastic board of directors, and they're very acutely aware of gender issues. Our scientific advisory board, which is very prominent, is 47 men, 24 women. We don't quite know how to measure that, whether that's good or bad. It looks bad, but we're not sure about the real proportion of men and women in the scientific community that would be eligible to serve on our scientific advisory board. Our diversity advisory board is 3 men and 2 women. And then Keystone Symposia staff is doing pretty well. They have 6 men and 29 women. So I am in a clear minority there. And the senior management is 2 men and 3 women. So we're sort of, to some level, practicing what we preach in some areas, but other areas we can certainly do better.
Do you think that the discrepancy is, I mean, I actually think that if you have 9 women to 13 men or whatever it is, the important thing is that you're getting the qualified people.
Yes.
And I think today it's more important to feel that you have qualified people and that women who are qualified are being included, not just to add women for women's sake.
Right.
I think we're hearing so much about that today, about just having X number of women or X number of this or X number of that. The important thing is excellence. And with a reputation for excellence, the qualified women and men will follow.
Right.
And I think that's the thing that has to be assured.
One of the things we found is you can populate your meetings and your boards with plenty of qualified women, and the science is spectacular. So there's no excuse to not have good diversity in your boards and in your meetings.
Do you think that there is, I mean, is it your perception that there is exclusion not if necessarily by intent, just that there is an exclusion that is worrisome?
In what exactly?
In terms of numbers?
You mean in our boards?
Yes.
Let me tell you what happens, and maybe this will answer your question. I sit with the scientific advisory. We have a nominating committee from our scientific advisory board that comes up with names. And people on there will sort of say, we need more people in cell biology. And they'll start reeling off names. And typically the men will name their male friends. And that's what we have to fight against. So I think it's more of a unconscious bias, if that's the right way to put it. These are the people that they know and they work with, and that's who they tend to nominate. So we have to go back and put in front of them lists of women, for example, that have really participated heavily in our meeting. And then when they look at those lists, they go, oh, yeah, such and such would be fantastic. So I don't know the answer to your question. I think there is an unconscious bias there. I think that's what it might be.
Exclude men from your nominating and
I'll bring that up.
I mean, that's sort of practical. Just ask the women, and I think you'll get the results you want. I'm sort of practical about those things.
Yes, that might be a good idea, actually. I'll just finish up quickly. Just a couple of anecdotal perspectives on our meetings. You know, our first female organizer was back in 1976, which was Alice Huang, who did a meeting with David Baltimore on animal virology. Our first female organizing team happened in 2006 on HIV vaccines. And that was a really good meeting. And actually, that grant also received our highest score for a conference grant, although we beat that this year with a perfect score. And then we've had 5 female Nobel laureate speakers. We've had lots more Nobel laureates over the years, but for the women, and there aren't many to pick from, we've had 5, and I think Elizabeth Blackburn, who's on the board here, has been to 14 of our meetings, which is amazing. And then 2,600 women have presented talks at our meetings in the last 6 years. And here I always find this list very impressive. These are some of our top attendee women, and Elaine Fuchs is 37 times. But there's a whole list of people there that have been to our meetings 20 times or more, and there's another 54 women that have spoken 12 to 19 times at the year. Now, of course, these data don't really mean anything, just that we do have women that really participate very actively in Keystone Symposia, and this is the kind of list that we put in front of our nominating committee when we ask them to seek out new board members. So moving forward, we don't think we're where we need to be, and we need to do more. And so we're continuing our efforts to increase the participation of women in our meetings, especially with regard to the scholarships, which I told you we were a little behind on, and also with regard to our board of directors and our scientific advisory board. And we're adopting new approaches and tools to make this happen. And one of the primary tools I find that works really well is to put names in front of people. So we've created a list of all the women, and incidentally all the URM participants at our meetings, along with the titles of their talks. This is a searchable database that we can give organizers access to through a password. And what we do is if there's an organizer that's seeking women, we've told them you don't have enough women on your program, they can do some searches, come up with names, and invariably they find highly qualified people that didn't spring to mind immediately until they saw this list. So we're still working on this as an approach, but it does seem to work. I tested it myself and it worked with me. And so we're sort of quite hopeful about that, and we're particularly hopeful for URMs. So let me quickly summarize. So we at Keystone Symposia truly believe that diversity is an essential component to an outstanding scientific meeting. And this isn't something we started yesterday. We've been doing this for some time. We believe, and this is debatable, that a key goal should be for the percentage of female speakers at the podium to reflect the percentage of female attendees, with some caveats that I mentioned about senior versus junior participants. And we've been relatively successful at this, but we've plateaued short of our goal, and we're trying to figure out why that is. And we're redoubling our efforts to promote women speakers at our meetings and enhance the number of females receiving scholarships and so on. I think we still have a ways to go, but I would say that our proactive stance has really helped. And I think it's important to have that proactive stance if you're going to make a difference. And with that, again, thank you for inviting me. And I just want to acknowledge all the people at Keystone Symposia that kind of helped me put this together. Thank you.